It's a month to the day since the NATO alliance was thrown into confusion by an attempted coup d'etat against President Erdogan in Turkey. But is an attempted academic coup happening in Turkey too, specifically on a mountain ridge in southeastern Anatolia? Göbekli Tepe, an extensive archaeological site said to predate UK's Stonehenge by 6,000 years, may be the oldest temple on Earth and the birthplace of agriculture, architecture and civilization. But why have well-connected elites implied that this highly sophisticated culture appeared fully formed as if by magic straight out of the Stone Age? Joining me now is the author of the international bestseller Magicians of the Gods, Graham Hancock. Graham, thanks for coming on the show. So let's begin with this site in Turkey. Why it's so important? The British archaeologist Ian Hodder at Stanford says it changes everything.
It changes everything. We can't look at history the same anymore. We've been spun a narrative for decades, even hundreds of years, about the origins of human civilization. It's supposed to be a slow, steady progress from primitive cavemen and hunter-gatherers through agriculture, through the big building projects to smart old us, you know, sitting here today. And what Göbekli Tepe says is no, it wasn't like that. There was an earlier episode of high civilization. We have this extraordinary site, a giant megalithic site with pillars weighing more than 20 tons, perfectly aligned to the heavens. It contains the world's first perfectly aligned north-south building, which involves astronomy. And as you said in your piece, it's 6,000 or even 7,000 years older than Stonehenge. Stonehenge has a background. We see it in a settled agricultural community that can create surpluses. Specialists can evolve. But in a place like Göbekli Tepe, the background is entirely hunter-gatherers. And then suddenly we see this huge building project taking place. And in the midst of it, surrounding it, agriculture suddenly appears. And the fantasy that archaeologists are maintaining is that some group of hunter-gatherers just woke up one morning equipped with all these skills to build the largest megalithic site ever seen on Earth, to invent agriculture. I don't think so. I think we're looking at a transfer of technology from the survivors of a lost civilization, destroyed in the giant global cataclysm that we know occurred at that time. The survivors of that lost civilization settled at Göbekli Tepe and transferred their skills to the local inhabitants. That's why it pops up out of nowhere with no background.
In fairness to the tale we've been spun, there has been the work of people like Rupert Sheldrake, who said it seems strange that civilizations all around the world happen to start around the same time.
Look, there are many of us working in this field who are troubled by the story of history that we're being given, that we're being fed, that's taught in the schools and universities, and that's relayed by the media. We're concerned about this. It seems to be a story that is designed to convince us that we're the point of it all, that the whole human project has been about us. And I think there's a tremendous arrogance in that, and a failure to learn the lessons of the past. And we should realize now that if we don't learn the lessons of the past, we are actually doomed to repeat them.
Now, you've written about subjects like this before. Göbekli Tepe suddenly sprang to life, as it were. But I mean, is it too early to draw these conclusions, given that only 5% has actually been excavated yet, or will that give more ammunition to you?
To me, the intriguing issue of Göbekli Tepe is that the excavated areas are already bigger than Stonehenge, but we know from ground-penetrating radar that 50 times as much still lies beneath the ground. I suspect that the whole hidden story of humanity is going to be revealed there. Göbekli Tepe is a very mysterious place. It was created 11,600 years ago. It ran for 1,000 years. Then they shut it down. They buried it. They completely covered it, a huge project to cover it. They actually covered it in a man-made hill. That's what Göbekli Tepe means in the Turkish language. It means pot-bellied hill. And then it wasn't seen again for more than 10,000 years. I feel all that effort, all that energy, the high science involved in the construction of the site, we're looking at a time capsule. They're saying, don't forget about us. There is another story that you've forgotten. Remember us. It's important. This is a time of awakening memory.
Okay, you mentioned these preconceptions of putting human beings at the center of the story. Is that
not only human beings at the center of the story? I think the problem is that we put ourselves at the center of the story, by which I mean 21st century technological civilization. We tend to the illusion that the whole story of human progress has been about us, about achieving us. but there may have been much greater things achieved in the past. And perhaps the achievement of human societies isn't only in material terms, but also in spiritual terms. And our society today is a spiritual pygmy. I mean, really, it's an infant in the realm of spirituality, and we have so much to learn from the ancients on this. I just think less modern arrogance, less overweening confidence in our own technology and prosperity, a little more humility, a little more willingness to listen to the past rather than simply to project our own personalities onto it.
But obviously 20th century philosophers of science and anthropologists have been trying to make this kind of point. Why do you think debate is more liable to be shut down nowadays? Because you've come under attack, of course.
I have indeed, and I have no problem in coming under attack. I think that when one puts forward extraordinary ideas, they should be subjected to the fire of criticism, and it's only if they can survive that fire that they're worthwhile. In some way. Look, we have a fantastic study called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. All scientists read it, and they know that knowledge in science doesn't progress by slow, gradual increments. It progresses by revolutions, where an old idea is overthrown and a new idea sweeps in and replaces it. Scientists know that this is how science works, and yet they doggedly and determinedly defend the existing model and attack anyone who attempts to propose an alternative model. And I can only say perhaps this is human nature, that we become so invested in a particular set of ideas that they become existentially connected to ourselves. And if the ideas are criticized, then we feel we're personally criticized, and it kicks in a huge territorial reaction. And that's what I see around the field of history. New evidence has come in, which means that the existing model of the origins of civilization cannot stand. And it's only a matter of time until that is recognized.
As you say, welcome attack, but presumably gets a bit more serious when you've sold millions of books, so people do know about your ideas. But when organizations shut down debate, as they did too, Rupert Sheldrake, the TED Talk people, they're run by a thing called the Sapling Foundation, they said the ideas, for instance, of Sheldrake, so far removed from mainstream scientific thinking that it's right to give health warnings when they eventually did put it up. What do you think of that?
Well, and oddly, TED have just done that with another talk that I did for one of their TEDx branches. They put a health warning on my talk. This latest talk is about the whole lost civilization issue. And they put a health warning on it as though they believe that their audience consists of children who can't make up their own minds. This is what's fundamentally I find so repulsive about TED, which it ought to be a beautiful thing about the sharing of ideas, but actually it's about the control of ideas. And TED only wants to present a particular agenda. With my previous talk, they solved the problem by just removing the talk from the internet. They were later forced to put it back up because the public reaction was so huge. With the latest talk, they've stuck this health warning over it. Come on, TED, stop being so patronizing. Understand that your audiences are intelligent. They have discernment. They can make up their own minds. It's okay for them to hear a point of view that doesn't coincide with yours.
I think they may have said it was about drugs in your case, and therefore regulatory...
You mean regarding the previous talk? No, again, that's not at all the issue. Yes, drugs were discussed in the previous talk, but TED have had many talks where drugs are discussed. The problem was I was making a suggestion about the nature of consciousness that they didn't like. I was suggesting that consciousness maybe isn't just generated and manufactured by the brain. Maybe it isn't just an epiphenomenon of brain activity. Maybe it's much more complicated than that. Maybe the relationship of consciousness to the brain is more like the relationship of a TV signal to the TV set. It's called non-local consciousness. I was suggesting that consciousness may not be confined to the brain. TED didn't like that. It goes against their fundamental materialist ideology where everything must be reduced to matter and there is no concept of spirit or transcendence.
Okay, but what do you think if this kind of shutting down of debate is affecting other disciplines, not just archaeology or psychology, I suppose?
I feel sure it is affecting other disciplines. In the discipline that I know about, I see that discipline massively affected by what is in fact a form of censorship. And I know that's happening because I know the subject and I know the people involved. In other subjects where I don't know the subject and I don't know the people, it seems to me that the same thing is happening, that false information is being presented as the truth.
You get any intimations of that when it comes to, say, geopolitics?
Yes, I do. I feel that these days I find it difficult to listen to television. I find it difficult to listen to 24-hour rolling misery, which is what the rolling news is, to convince us that the world is just filled with hatred and fear and suspicion. What we need to do is to emphasize the human capacity for love, for courage, for strength, for decency, for goodness. We need to hear about that every day, because there's many more examples of that than there is of the stuff that the media welter in at the moment.
Do you think, ironically, one of the pressures is dialectical materialism? You've written previously about the international aid business.
Yes. I've always been a bit of an outsider, taking a rather radical point of view.
Just take us back to that.
Well, back in the 80s, I published a book called Lords of Poverty: The Freewheeling Lifestyles, Power, Prestige, and Corruption of the Multi-Billion-Dollar Aid Business. I happen to think aid is a really bad thing. I don't think it does any good. I think it keeps the world locked in an impossible situation. It's a band-aid to a problem that needs to be solved a totally different way. It allows the rich countries to feel generous and altruistic. They're not being generous and altruistic at all. They're just controlling the world. It's a mechanism of control. I felt that very strongly in the 80s. I'd spent the whole of the 80s traveling around, seeing development projects, and I told it like it was.
But any growing optimism about that? Growing acceptance
I think
of those ideas?
I think,
although Britain, of course, says it must keep its aid budget up at this percentage.
I think the whole concept of aid is faulty. I think it's patronizing. It implies that we know and they don't know. I think the concept of helping one another as human beings, that's a different matter. But when we create these large bureaucracies, fund them with massive amounts of public money and give them huge power to create giant dams and roads in countries that perhaps need some other form of development, then we're doing a bad thing.
So how do you think we can reform academia, for instance, so that we can have the sort of debates you want to have?
I think it's in process now. I think we're in the middle of a huge paradigm shift for humanity. We are living at the time when human beings finally are waking up all around the world. It's slow. It's not a huge flame yet, but it's growing, and it's brighter every day. And a time will come when these debates, these discussions, the mind control of the past, the stupidity, the locking into ideology, all of that will be regarded as a folly of our infancy.
Graham Hancock, thank you.